Hi, I'm Sarah. At my sister's engagement party, she stood up in front of everyone and announced that while she inherited Dad's stocks and jewelry, poor Sarah got stuck with Uncle Harold's worthless shack and 40 acres of trees. The entire country club erupted in laughter as she suggested I could maybe sell the firewood to cover the property taxes. 3 hours later, I was sitting across from Margaret Rodriguez, Senior Trust Officer at First National, as she calmly informed me that my worthless inheritance was actually part of a $75 million estate. Have you ever been dismissed by your own family, only to discover they had no idea what they were talking about? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I should have known something was different about the way Uncle Harold left things. The old man had always been unconventional, living in that simple cabin outside Bend while working as what everyone called a paper pusher for the county. When he passed away 3 months ago, the family lawyer read his will in our mother's living room like it was just another piece of routine business. Jennifer got the stock portfolio and some jewelry that had belonged to our grandmother. Mom received his small savings account and personal effects. I got the cabin and the land it sat on. Well, Jennifer had said, not even trying to hide her smirk, "I guess Harold really did see you as the outdoorsy type, Sarah." She was already calculating the value of her inheritance on her phone, while I held the deed to property I'd visited maybe 5 times in my life. The general consensus in the room was that I'd drawn the short straw. 40 acres of Douglas fir and a cabin that needed significant repairs didn't exactly scream financial windfall. My mother patted my shoulder with the kind of sympathy reserved for consolation prizes. "Maybe you can use it as a vacation spot, honey. Or there might be enough timber value to help with your student loans." Even she couldn't muster much enthusiasm for what everyone viewed as Harold's final act of eccentricity. The man had always marched to his own drummer, they said, and apparently his generosity followed the same peculiar logic. David, my boyfriend of 2 years, drove me out to see the property the weekend after the will reading. He worked as a social worker downtown and had that steady, practical way of looking at situations that helped ground me when family dynamics got overwhelming. We took his Honda Civic because my ancient Toyota probably wouldn't have made the 3-hour drive to Central Oregon without breaking down. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through tall trees and natural clearings dotted with wild flowers. It was peaceful in a way that made the city noise in my head finally quiet down, but I could see why the family considered it essentially worthless. The structure itself was maybe 800 square feet, built sometime in the 1960s with materials that had seen better decades. The roof needed work, the front porch sagged slightly, and the whole place had that musty smell of a house that had been empty too long. "It's got good bones," David said, running his hand along the solid log construction. He was trying to be encouraging, but even he couldn't ignore the scope of repairs that would be needed to make it livable. We spent the afternoon walking the property lines, following old deer trails through sections of forest that seemed to stretch forever. There was something calming about the way afternoon light filtered through the canopy, but 40 acres of trees don't pay elementary school teacher salaries. I taught 3rd grade at Franklin Elementary in southeast Portland, a job I loved despite the financial limitations that came with it. My students were everything to me, 8-year-old bundles of energy and curiosity who made every day feel meaningful. But meaningful doesn't cover rent in Portland's increasingly expensive housing market, and it definitely doesn't cover the kind of property maintenance that Harold's cabin would require. Jennifer, meanwhile, had wasted no time converting her inheritance into liquid assets. She worked as a corporate lawyer for one of Portland's larger firms and had always possessed an impressive talent for turning everything into a financial calculation. Within 2 weeks of receiving Harold's stocks, she'd repositioned the portfolio and was already talking about using the gains as a down payment on a larger house in the West Hills. The timing couldn't be better, she told Mom and me over dinner at her favorite downtown restaurant. Michael and I have been looking at properties in Portland Heights, and Harold's little gift is going to make that possible much sooner than we expected. Michael Torres, her fiancé, worked as an investment banker and nodded approvingly as she described their plans. They were both the type of people who measured success in square footage and neighborhood prestige. That dinner was also when Jennifer announced their engagement party. "We're thinking the Riverside Country Club," she said, already scrolling through potential dates on her phone. "Michael's parents are members, and it's the perfect venue for the kind of celebration we want." She glanced at me across the table. "You should definitely come, Sarah. It'll be fun to have the whole family there." The invitation felt less like inclusion and more like obligation, but I agreed because that's what families do. David encouraged me to go, pointing out that Jennifer's major life events didn't happen often and maybe this would be a chance for us to connect on better terms. He had an optimistic view of human nature that I simultaneously admired and envied. The weeks leading up to the party were busy with the end of the school year. My third graders were preparing for their transition to fourth grade, which meant extra attention to students who were struggling and final projects that showcased everything they'd learned. Teaching had always been my calling, even though it meant living paycheck to paycheck in a city where costs seemed to increase every month. I'd started visiting Harold's cabin on weekends, partly because I needed to assess what repairs were most urgent and partly because I found the solitude restorative after weeks of managing 28 energetic 8-year-olds. The property had a way of putting things in perspective. There was something about the scale of the forest and the way morning mist moved through the trees that made my daily worries feel smaller and more manageable. During one of those visits, I met Frank Peterson, Harold's neighbor whose own property bordered mine to the north. Frank was in his 70s, a retired logger who'd lived in the area his entire life. He stopped by when he saw my car in the driveway, introducing himself and offering help if I needed anything. "Harold was good people," Frank said, accepting the cup of coffee I offered him on.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The cabin's front porch. Quiet man, but he knew this land better than anyone. Used to walk every inch of it, taking notes in those little notebooks he always carried. Frank gestured toward the forest around us. He had a real appreciation for what he had here. That conversation stayed with me as I drove back to Portland. Harold had always seemed like a simple man with simple pleasures, but Frank's description suggested someone who paid careful attention to details that others might miss. It made me curious about what exactly Harold had seen in this property that made him want to preserve it and why he'd chosen to leave it specifically to me. The engagement party arrived on a perfect May evening. The Riverside Country Club sat on a bluff overlooking the Willamette River, its manicured grounds and elegant architecture designed to impress. I wore a simple blue dress I'd found at a consignment shop in my neighborhood, paired with comfortable flats and minimal jewelry. The setting demanded a certain level of formality, but I'd never been comfortable with the kind of ostentatious display that Jennifer seemed to thrive on. The guest list included Michael's colleagues from the bank, Jennifer's law firm partners, and various friends from their social circle. These were people who drove luxury cars and discussed vacation homes as casually as I talked about lesson plans. I felt immediately out of place, like an imposter who'd wandered into someone else's carefully curated life. Jennifer looked stunning in a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary. She moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was, accepting congratulations and discussing wedding plans with the kind of animated enthusiasm that drew people into her orbit. She was genuinely good at this type of social performance, something I'd never quite mastered. The cocktail hour stretched on with conversations about stock market performance and real estate values, topics where I had little to contribute. David did his best to engage with Michael's banking colleagues, asking thoughtful questions about their work. But I could see him struggling with the underlying assumption that financial success was the primary measure of personal worth. When dinner was announced, I found myself seated at a table toward the back of the room with some of Michael's extended family and Jennifer's college roommate, people who knew enough about me to be polite but didn't really know me at all. The conversation focused mainly on wedding planning details and speculation about where Jennifer and Michael might honeymoon. Sarah teaches elementary school, Jennifer's roommate mentioned when someone asked what I did for work. The tone suggested she was trying to be inclusive, but there was something slightly condescending about the way she presented my career as a conversation piece rather than a profession. "That's so nice," responded one of Michael's aunts. "It must be rewarding working with children. And you have summers off, right?" It was the kind of comment that revealed how little most people understood about teaching, but I smiled and nodded rather than launching into an explanation of summer curriculum planning and continuing education requirements. The evening might have continued in this vein of polite but superficial interaction, if Jennifer hadn't decided to make the inheritance part of her entertainment. It happened during dessert, when she stood up with a champagne flute to make what everyone assumed would be a standard engagement toast. "Michael and I are so grateful to have all of you here celebrating with us tonight," she began, hitting all the expected notes about love and commitment and shared futures. The crowd settled in for the kind of gracious remarks that these occasions typically featured. But then Jennifer's expression shifted slightly, taking on the mischievous look I remembered from childhood when she was about to say something that would get one of us in trouble. "I also want to share something that I think perfectly illustrates how unexpected life can be," she continued, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "A few months ago, our great-uncle Harold passed away and left the family some inherited property. Now Harold was a sweet man, but he lived very simply in a little cabin in the woods." Nervous laughter rippled through the audience as people tried to figure out where this story was heading. When the lawyer read the will, Jennifer said, pausing for dramatic effect, "My practical sister Jennifer received a nice stock portfolio and some family jewelry. Our mother got Harold's savings and personal items, and my little sister Sarah," she gestured toward my table with a flourish, "inherited Harold's cabin and 40 acres of trees." The laughter started quietly but grew as Jennifer continued her narrative. "Now we're talking about a cabin that was built in the 1960s and probably hasn't been updated since. 40 acres of Douglas fir in the middle of nowhere, hours from any real civilization. The property taxes alone will probably cost more than it's worth." She raised her glass toward me with exaggerated sympathy. "Poor Sarah got the consolation prize, maybe she can sell firewood to cover the expenses." The entire room erupted in laughter at this point. These were people who understood real estate values and investment returns, and the idea of inheriting rural timberland instead of liquid assets struck them as genuinely amusing. I felt heat rising in my cheeks as conversations at nearby tables turned to speculation about what I might actually do with such an impractical inheritance. "I mean, what do you even do with 40 acres of trees?" Jennifer asked the room rhetorically. "Start a lumber company? Become a hermit like Uncle Harold?" More laughter followed, and I realized that this wasn't just casual family teasing. Jennifer was using my inheritance as entertainment, turning what should have been private family business into a public joke for the amusement of her social circle. Michael stood up beside her, clearly enjoying the story. "Maybe Sarah can turn it into a summer camp or something," he suggested with a grin. "City kids love that outdoor experience stuff." The suggestion was met with knowing chuckles from people who viewed nature as something to be experienced in carefully managed doses rather than lived with on a daily basis. I looked around the table where I was sitting, expecting to see at least some sympathy for my position, but found only the kind of amused pity people reserve for someone else's misfortune when it doesn't directly affect them. These strangers were enjoying Jennifer's story because it confirmed their assumptions about practical value and smart financial planning. The best part, Jennifer continued, clearly warming to her theme, is that Sarah actually drove out there to look at it, 3 hours each way to see a rundown cabin and a bunch of trees. I told her she should at least check if there's any timber value, but honestly, by the time you pay for logging equipment and transportation costs, she'd probably end up owing money. That comment drew knowing nods from several people who apparently considered themselves experts on forestry economics. I felt smaller with each passing moment, like I was shrinking into my chair while everyone else loomed larger around me. This was supposed to be Jennifer's engagement celebration, but somehow it had turned into a public assessment of my poor judgment and financial naivety. David reached under the table and squeezed my hand, offering what comfort he could in the circumstances. But even his support couldn't offset the humiliation of having my inheritance treated as a punchline for people who didn't know me and would never have to live with the consequences of their amusement. "Maybe there's oil under all those trees," someone called out from across the room, generating another wave of laughter. The suggestion was clearly meant as a joke, but it carried the implicit message that only something completely unexpected could make my inheritance worthwhile. Jennifer smiled and raised her glass one final time. "Here's to Uncle Harold's unique sense of generosity," she announced, "and to Sarah, who now owns more trees than anyone else in the family." The toast was met with enthusiastic applause and laughter, sealing my humiliation as part of the evening's official entertainment. I excused myself as soon as politely possible, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely fabricated. David followed me out to the parking lot, where I stood beside his car taking deep breaths of cool evening air and trying to process what had just happened inside. "She crossed a line in there," he said quietly, putting his arm around my shoulders. "That wasn't teasing, that was cruel." His anger on my behalf was comforting, but it couldn't undo the public nature of what had just occurred, or the fact that my own family had orchestrated it. We drove home mostly in silence, both of us processing the evening in our own ways. I kept replaying Jennifer's speech, wondering if there had been malicious intent or just thoughtless insensitivity. Either way, the result was the same. I'd been made to feel foolish and naive in front of people whose opinion of me would now forever be shaped by the image of the impractical teacher who inherited worthless land. That night, I lay awake thinking about Uncle Harold and his motivations for structuring his will the way he had. Everyone assumed he'd simply made an eccentric choice based on his perception of our individual personalities. Jennifer got liquid assets because she understood financial planning. I got land because I was the outdoorsy type who might appreciate nature over numbers. But what if there was more to his decision than anyone realized? Harold had been quiet and unassuming, but he'd also been intelligent and observant. Frank Peterson's comments about Harold's careful attention to his property suggested someone who understood exactly what he owned and why it mattered. Maybe Harold's choice wasn't random or sentimental. Maybe there was something about that land that nobody else had bothered to investigate. The thought was probably wishful thinking, but it gave me something to focus on besides the memory of Jennifer's laughter echoing through the country club dining room. The morning after Jennifer's engagement party, I woke up with the kind of emotional hangover that comes from public humiliation. David had already left for work, leaving a note on the kitchen counter that said, "Call in sick and take care of yourself today, love you." The suggestion was tempting, but I had 28 third graders who depended on consistency, and hiding at home wouldn't change what had happened the night before. Franklin Elementary sat in a neighborhood where gentrification hadn't quite reached, which meant the building was older and the resources limited, but the community still felt authentic. My classroom was on the second floor with windows that overlooked a small playground where kids gathered before school started. I'd decorated the walls with student artwork and motivational posters, creating the kind of environment where 8-year-olds felt safe to make mistakes and ask questions. Teaching had always been my sanctuary, the one place where my value was measured by how well I could help children learn and grow, rather than by my net worth or social connections. My students didn't care that I drove a 15-year-old Toyota or shopped at thrift stores. They cared that I listened when they had problems and celebrated when they finally mastered long division. But even the familiar routine of lesson plans and spelling tests couldn't completely distract me from replaying Jennifer's speech. Every time I had a quiet moment between activities, I found myself remembering the laughter that followed her description of my consolation prize. The worst part wasn't even the mockery itself, but the way it had been delivered with such casual cruelty, as if my feelings were irrelevant compared to her entertainment value. During lunch break, I sat in my empty classroom grading math worksheets and trying to focus on anything other than the previous evening. That's when Linda Washington knocked on my door. Linda was Franklin Elementary's principal, a woman in her 50s who'd spent 30 years in education and had developed an impressive ability to read people's emotional states. "Rough night?" she asked, settling into one of the tiny plastic chairs that were designed for 8-year-olds. Linda had a way of cutting straight to the heart of things without making it feel like an interrogation. I found myself telling her about the engagement party and Jennifer's public commentary on my inheritance. Linda listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding in a way that suggested she'd encountered similar family dynamics before. People sometimes reveal more about themselves than they realize when they're trying to make others look foolish, Linda said when I finished. Your sister's behavior says nothing about the value of what you inherited and everything about her need to position herself as superior. The insight was helpful, but it didn't solve my practical problem. I still owned 40 acres of trees that required property taxes and maintenance, and I still had no clear idea how to manage either responsibility on a teacher's salary. Have you looked into what options you have with the land? Linda asked. Sometimes inherited property has possibilities that aren't immediately obvious. That afternoon, I drove straight from school to the Multnomah County Assessor's office downtown. If I was going to own this property, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with beyond Jennifer's dismissive assumptions. The clerk who helped me was a middle-aged woman named Ruth, who'd apparently been fielding property questions for decades. "Harold Mitchell's place," she said, pulling up the records on her computer. "Let's see what we have here." She scrolled through several screens of information, occasionally making small sounds of interest that made me wonder what she was discovering. "Well, this is interesting," Ruth said finally. "Your great-uncle's property has some unusual characteristics. The mineral rights are intact, which isn't always the case with older properties, and there's been some recent surveying activity in the area." I had no idea what mineral rights meant in practical terms, but Ruth explained that many property owners had sold their subsurface rights decades earlier, leaving future owners with land, but no claim to anything valuable that might be discovered underground. "Harold held on to everything," Ruth continued. "Mineral rights, timber rights, water rights, the whole package. That's actually fairly unusual for someone who wasn't actively developing the land." The surveying activity was even more intriguing. Apparently there had been extensive geological surveys conducted throughout the region over the past 2 years, including areas that bordered Harold's property. Ruth couldn't provide specific details about what the surveys had found, but she suggested I contact the companies involved if I wanted more information. I left the assessor's office with more questions than answers, but also with the first indication that Harold's land might be more complex than anyone in the family realized. The drive home took me through downtown Portland's early evening traffic, giving me time to process what I'd learned and consider what steps to take next. That weekend, David and I made another trip to the cabin. This time, I brought the surveying information Ruth had provided and a more systematic approach to exploring the property. We started by walking the boundaries with Harold's old property maps, trying to get a better sense of exactly what 40 acres looked like when you had to cover it on foot. The land was more varied than I'd initially realized. The section closest to the cabin was primarily Douglas fir forest, but there were also meadows, a seasonal creek, and areas where the terrain changed dramatically. Harold had maintained a network of trails that connected different parts of the property, suggesting he'd spent considerable time exploring every corner of what he owned. "He really knew this place," David observed as we followed one of Harold's trails to a ridge that offered views across the surrounding valley. "These trails aren't random, they're designed to showcase the best features of the land." We spent hours walking Harold's routes, and I began to understand why he'd chosen to live so simply while owning something so beautiful. The property had a kind of quiet majesty that revealed itself gradually, like a book that got better with each reading. There were spots where morning light filtered through the trees in ways that made you want to sit and watch for hours, and clearings where wildflowers created natural gardens that shifted with the seasons. But beauty doesn't pay property taxes, and I was no closer to understanding how Harold had expected me to manage the financial responsibilities that came with ownership. The more time I spent on the land, the more I appreciated what he'd preserved, but appreciation alone wouldn't solve my practical concerns. It was Frank Peterson who provided the next piece of the puzzle. I ran into him at the general store in the nearest town, a place called Sisters that served as the commercial hub for the scattered rural community. Frank was buying supplies and recognized me from my previous visits to the cabin. "You've been spending more time out there," he observed as we stood in line together, "getting to know the place better." I mentioned the surveying activity Ruth had told me about, and Frank's expression grew more serious. "Yeah, there's been a lot of interest in this area lately," he said. "Companies looking into development possibilities, checking on resource potential." Frank suggested we grab coffee at the diner next door, where he could explain what he'd observed over the past few years. The diner was the kind of place where local farmers and ranchers gathered to discuss weather and politics, and Frank clearly knew everyone in the room. "Your uncle was a smart man," Frank said once we'd settled into a corner booth, "smarter than most people realized. He used to work for the county planning department before he retired, and he understood land use patterns better than anyone around here." According to Frank, Harold had been quietly tracking development trends throughout Central Oregon for decades. He'd watched as cities like Bend grew rapidly, pushing suburban development further into rural areas. He'd also followed the natural resource industries, understanding which areas were likely to become valuable for mining or energy development. Harold used to joke that he was sitting on his retirement fund, Frank said. But I don't think he was entirely joking. He knew something about that land that he didn't share with most people. The conversation gave me a new perspective on Harold's decision-making. Maybe his choice to live simply hadn't been about rejecting material wealth so much as understanding that patience could be more valuable than immediate gratification. If Harold had believed his land would eventually become significantly more valuable, leaving it to me might have been an act of strategic generosity rather than eccentric sentiment. When David and I returned to Portland that evening, I felt more motivated to investigate the surveying companies Ruth had mentioned. It took several phone calls and some persistent questioning, but I eventually reached a geologist named Dr. William Barnes who'd been involved in the regional surveys. Dr. Barnes was initially reluctant to discuss specific findings, but when I explained that I owned property in the surveyed area, he became more forthcoming. "There's been significant interest in that region for multiple reasons," he said. "Mineral deposits, potential energy resources, and development suitability all factor into the assessments." He couldn't provide detailed information over the phone, but he suggested I bring my property documentation to his office for a more comprehensive consultation. "If you're planning any development or considering sale options, it would be worth understanding exactly what you're working with," he said. The appointment was scheduled for the following Thursday afternoon, which meant taking a half day off from teaching. Linda Washington was supportive when I explained the situation, suggesting that understanding my inheritance was important enough to justify the absence. Barnes's office was located in a professional building near Portland State University, surrounded by geological maps and core samples that suggested serious scientific work. He was a man in his 60s with the kind of methodical approach that comes from decades of analyzing complex data. "Let me see what you have," he said, examining Harold's property maps and the county records I'd brought. He compared them against his own surveys and geological assessments, occasionally consulting reference materials from his extensive files. "This is quite interesting, Doctor," Barnes said after nearly an hour of analysis. "Your property sits at the intersection of several geological features that make it potentially very valuable." He pulled out a detailed topographical map that showed subsurface formations I couldn't begin to interpret.
First, you're sitting on confirmed natural gas deposits, he explained, pointing to areas marked on his map. Not enormous reserves, but significant enough to generate substantial income over time.
There are mineral formations that suggest possible rare earth deposits, though that would require more extensive testing to confirm. The information was overwhelming, but Dr. Barnes wasn't finished. Third, and potentially most immediately valuable, your land is directly in the path of major infrastructure development. The state is planning highway expansion that will increase access to this region dramatically, and there are preliminary discussions about light rail extension that could eventually reach this area. I struggled to process what he was telling me. My worthless inheritance of trees and an old cabin was potentially sitting on top of natural gas rare minerals and in the path of major transportation improvements. No wonder Harold had held onto his mineral rights and maintained such detailed knowledge of his property. What does this mean in practical terms? I asked, feeling completely out of my depth. Dr. Barnes leaned back in his chair and considered the question. In practical terms, you're looking at several different income streams and development possibilities. Gas extraction could provide steady royalty income, mineral rights could be leased or developed, and the land itself could become extremely valuable for residential or commercial development once the infrastructure improvements are completed. He cautioned that realizing these possibilities would require significant legal and financial navigation, and that timeline could vary considerably depending on regulatory approvals and market conditions. But the underlying value was undeniable. If I had to estimate current value based on confirmed resources and development potential, Dr. Barnes said carefully, you're looking at something in the range of $15 to $20 million, with potential for much more as infrastructure projects move forward. The number hit me like a physical blow. $20 million for land that Jennifer had described as worthless trees and a rundown cabin, for property that the entire family had viewed as Harold's consolation prize for the impractical granddaughter who chose teaching over financial planning. I sat in Dr. Barnes's office trying to absorb what he'd told me while he continued explaining the various factors that contributed to his assessment. His voice seemed to be coming from very far away as I processed the magnitude of what Harold had actually left me. Are you absolutely certain about this? I asked when he finished his explanation. The geological data is solid, he replied. The infrastructure development is a matter of public record, though timelines can always change. The natural gas reserves have been confirmed through core sampling. What I can't predict is exactly when and how these values will be realized, but the underlying assets are definitely there. I left Dr. Barnes's office in a state of shock. The 3-hour drive back to Portland passed in a blur of disjointed thoughts about Harold's motivations, Jennifer's humiliation tactics, and my complete lack of preparation for managing assets worth millions of dollars. David was waiting at my apartment when I arrived, takeout containers from our favorite Thai restaurant spread across the kitchen table. He took one look at my expression and set down his chopsticks. What did you find out? He asked gently. I told him everything Dr. Barnes had explained, watching his face change as the implications became clear. David was practical enough to understand the financial significance, but also thoughtful enough to recognize the emotional complexity of the situation. $20 million, he repeated quietly. Harold left you $20 million worth of land, and your family treated it like a joke. The contrast was almost too stark to process. Less than a week earlier, I'd been publicly humiliated for inheriting what everyone considered worthless property. Now I was potentially one of the wealthiest people I knew, and nobody except David and Dr. Barnes had any idea. That night, I lay awake thinking about Harold and his quiet confidence in his decisions. He'd lived simply not because he had no choice, but because he'd chosen to value things differently than most people. He'd seen potential where others saw only problems, and he'd been patient enough to wait for the right time to act on that knowledge. The question now was what I intended to do with what he'd given me. The responsible choice would be to contact lawyers and financial advisors who could help me navigate the complex process of developing or selling these assets. But first, I needed to decide whether I was ready for my life to change as dramatically as Harold's gift was about to make possible. I also needed to figure out how to handle my family's inevitable reaction when they learned the truth about my consolation prize. Jennifer's public mockery had been cruel, but it was based on assumptions that everyone shared at the time. Now that those assumptions had been proven spectacularly wrong, I faced the complicated task of deciding how much grace to extend to people who had shown me none. The next few days passed in a strange state of suspended reality. I continued teaching my third graders, grading papers, and managing the routine responsibilities of my everyday life, while carrying the secret knowledge that everything was about to change. Nobody around me had any idea that the woman they knew as Sarah, the elementary school teacher, had suddenly become Sarah, the potential millionaire. Linda Washington noticed that I seemed distracted and asked if everything was okay with my family situation. I gave her a vague answer about still working through the inheritance details, which was technically true, but hardly captured the full scope of what I was dealing with. The hardest part was deciding when and how to tell my mother and Jennifer what Dr. Barnes had discovered. They deserved to know that their assumptions about Harold's bequest had been completely wrong, but I wasn't sure I was ready for the conversations that revelation would inevitably trigger. I knew Jennifer well enough to predict that she'd be furious about her public comments at the engagement party, not because she'd been cruel, but because she'd been wrong. Her primary concern would be managing the damage to her reputation among the people who'd witnessed her speech about my worthless inheritance. My mother's reaction would be more complex. She'd be pleased that Harold's gift had turned out to be valuable, but she'd also feel guilty about her role in dismissing its potential. Mom had always tried to maintain neutrality in conflicts between Jennifer and me, but her silence during the engagement party had felt like complicity. Before I dealt with family complications, though, I needed professional guidance. Dr. Barnes had given me names of attorneys and financial advisors who specialized in complex inheritance situations, and I spent the weekend researching their backgrounds and expertise. The law firm that seemed most appropriate was Morrison, Klein & Associates, a downtown Portland practice that handled estate planning and natural resource law. I scheduled a consultation with Patricia Klein, one of the founding partners, for the following Tuesday afternoon. The Morrison Klein offices occupied an entire floor of a downtown high-rise, with conference rooms that offered panoramic views of the Willamette River and the mountains beyond. Patricia Klein was a woman in her 40s with the kind of sharp intelligence that comes from decades of handling complex legal problems. Dr. Barnes sent over his preliminary assessment. She said after reviewing my situation, "This is quite a significant inheritance, and there are multiple legal considerations we'll need to address." Patricia explained that managing assets of this magnitude required careful planning to minimize tax liability and protect my interests in any development or extraction agreements. She also warned that news of valuable natural resources had a way of attracting attention from various parties who might claim legitimate or illegitimate interests in the property. "Your first priority should be confirming ownership and ensuring that all documentation is properly filed and protected," she said. "After that, we can explore your options for development, sale, or long-term management of the assets." The consultation lasted 2 hours and covered topics I'd never imagined needing to understand: mineral rights law, environmental regulations, tax optimization strategies, and asset protection structures. By the time it ended, I had a clear sense that managing Harold's gift properly would require professional expertise I couldn't provide myself. Patricia agreed to represent me in securing the property rights and exploring development possibilities. Her firm would handle the legal complexities while I made decisions about how I wanted to proceed with the various opportunities Dr. Barnes had identified.
Walking out of the law offices, I felt simultaneously empowered and overwhelmed. Harold's simple bequest was turning into something that would require sophisticated management and careful decision-making. I was no longer just a teacher who'd inherited some land. I was becoming someone who needed to understand complex business and legal matters that most people never encounter. That realization brought me back to thinking about Jennifer's engagement party speech and the assumptions everyone had made about my inheritance. In less than 2 weeks, I'd gone from being the family member who got the consolation prize to potentially being wealthier than all of them combined. The irony was too perfect to ignore, but it also felt like a responsibility I hadn't asked for. Harold had trusted me with something valuable, and now I needed to prove worthy of that trust, while figuring out how to navigate the family dynamics that his gift would inevitably complicate. Looking back, I think that was the moment when I truly understood what Harold had done. He hadn't just left me valuable land, he'd left me a test of character. How I handled the knowledge, the wealth, and the power that came with his gift would determine whether I deserved what he'd chosen to give me. The weight of Patricia Klein's legal advice settled over me like a heavy blanket as I drove home through Portland's evening traffic. Every red light gave me another moment to process the reality that my simple inheritance had become something requiring sophisticated legal management and financial planning. The Toyota's radio played softly in the background, but I couldn't focus on anything except the echo of Patricia's words about asset protection and tax optimization strategies. My apartment felt different when I walked through the door that evening. The same modest furniture and second-hand decorations, the same stack of ungraded papers on the kitchen table, but everything carried new weight now that I understood what Harold's gift actually meant. I was still Sarah Mitchell, elementary school teacher, but I was also potentially Sarah Mitchell, holder of mineral rights worth millions of dollars. David arrived an hour later with Chinese takeout and the gentle expression he wore when he knew I needed to talk through something complicated. We spread the food across my small dining table, and I told him about the consultation with Patricia Klein, trying to explain legal concepts I barely understood myself. She says I need to file additional documentation to protect the mineral rights, I said, poking at my lomeng without much appetite. Apparently there are people who specialize in identifying valuable properties with unclear ownership structures and finding ways to challenge inheritance claims. David set down his chopsticks and looked at me seriously. Sarah, do you realize what's happening here? You're not just dealing with a valuable inheritance anymore, you're potentially dealing with the kind of money that changes everything about how you live. The observation was accurate but overwhelming. I'd spent my entire adult life living paycheck to paycheck, making careful decisions about whether I could afford new shoes or dinner out. The idea of having access to millions of dollars felt abstract and surreal, like discussing a hypothetical situation that might happen to someone else. I keep thinking about Harold, I admitted. He lived so simply, but he knew all along what that land was worth. Why didn't he develop it himself? Why save it for me? David considered the question while we finished eating. Maybe he was waiting for the right time, or maybe he wanted to give you choices he never had. Either way, he trusted you with something incredibly valuable. That night, I dreamed about Uncle Harold's cabin, but in the dream the forest around it was full of machinery and construction equipment. I woke up feeling unsettled, wondering if pursuing the development possibilities would mean destroying what Harold had worked to preserve. The next morning brought an unexpected phone call from my mother. "Sarah, honey, I've been thinking about what Jennifer said at the engagement party," she began without preamble. "I should have spoken up when she made those comments about your inheritance. That wasn't appropriate." The apology caught me off guard. Mom rarely acknowledged family conflicts directly, preferring to let tensions resolve themselves over time. "It's okay, Mom," I said, though it wasn't entirely true. Jennifer was just being Jennifer. "No, it's not okay," Mom replied firmly. Your inheritance is your business, and she had no right to turn it into entertainment for her friends. I wanted you to know that I spoke with her about it. I wondered what that conversation had been like and whether Jennifer had been receptive to criticism about her behavior. But before I could ask, Mom continued with news that explained her timing. Actually, I'm calling because I had an interesting conversation with my real estate colleague yesterday. She mentioned that there's been unusual activity in the Central Oregon property market lately, particularly around the Bend area. Companies doing surveys, investors looking at land purchases, that sort of thing. My stomach tightened. What kind of activity? Nothing specific, but enough to make people in the business take notice. She wondered if I knew anything about it, since she remembered Harold had property in that region. Mom paused. Sarah, is there something about Harold's land that we don't know? The question hung in the air between us. I could hear the curiosity in her voice, mixed with what might have been concern. This was the moment when I had to decide how much to reveal and how quickly. I've been doing some research, I said carefully. There might be more to the property than we initially thought. What kind of more? I took a deep breath and made the decision to trust her with at least part of the truth. Mom, I think Harold's land might be worth significantly more than anyone realized. I've been talking to experts who think there could be natural resources or development potential we didn't know about. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had been dropped. Finally, Mom spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. How much more, Sarah? I'm still trying to understand all the details, but potentially a lot more. Maybe enough to change everything. Another long pause. Oh my God, does Jennifer know? Not yet. I wanted to get all the facts before I said anything to the family. Sarah, Mom's voice became urgent. You need to be very careful about how you handle this. If that land is truly valuable, Jennifer is going to be. She trailed off, but we both knew what she meant. Jennifer was going to be furious that she'd publicly mocked something worth millions, and she was going to want to find a way to claim a share of what she'd dismissed as worthless. Mom understood her older daughter well enough to predict that Jennifer's reaction would be complicated by embarrassment and greed in equal measure. Can you give me a little more time before you say anything to her? I asked. I'm still working with lawyers to understand all the implications. Of course, but Sarah, promise me you'll be careful. Money changes people, and family money can be especially complicated. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table thinking about Mom's warning. She was right that money complicated family relationships, but in this case, the complication wasn't the money itself. It was the fact that everyone had already revealed their true attitudes about my judgment and worth when they thought Harold's gift was meaningless. The rest of the week passed in a strange dual existence. During the day, I taught my third graders about multiplication tables and reading comprehension, maintaining the normal rhythm of lesson plans and parent conferences. In the evenings, I reviewed legal documents and tried to educate myself about mineral rights law and natural resource development. Patricia Klein's office called twice with updates on the documentation process. The first call confirmed that Harold's ownership of all subsurface rights was legally sound and properly recorded. The second call brought news that made my situation even more complex. Sarah, we've discovered something interesting in our research, Patricia's assistant told me. Your great-uncle's property isn't just valuable on its own, it's part of a larger geological formation that extends across several properties in the area. The companies interested in natural gas extraction would need access to your land to efficiently develop the entire region. The information added another layer of value and complexity to my inheritance. Not only did I own valuable resources, but I owned resources that other people needed to access their own valuable resources. That gave me leverage I hadn't anticipated but also made me a target for pressure tactics I wasn't prepared to handle. Patricia scheduled another meeting for the following week to discuss negotiation strategies and help me understand the various proposals I was likely to receive once word got out about the geological surveys. It's important that you're prepared before the energy companies start making offers, she explained. These negotiations can move very quickly once they begin. That weekend, David and I made what I suspected might be my last quiet visit to Harold's cabin. I wanted to spend time on the land before it became the center of legal and business discussions that would change everything about my relationship with the property. We arrived on Saturday morning to find Frank Peterson working in his garden. He waved when he saw my car and walked over to greet us, wiping soil from his hands on an old towel. "You've been busy lately," he observed, "lots of official-looking cars coming and going from Harold's place." I realized that Frank had probably been watching the surveying teams and legal consultants who'd been evaluating the property. In a small rural community, that kind of activity would definitely be noticed and discussed. "I'm trying to understand exactly what Harold left me," I said, deciding that honesty was the best approach with someone who'd known Harold well and clearly cared about the land. Frank nodded slowly. "Harold always said this property would surprise people someday. He used to joke that he was sitting on his retirement, but I think he was more serious about that than most folks realized." We talked for nearly an hour about Harold's personality and his approach to the land. Frank shared stories about Harold's meticulous record-keeping and his habit of walking the property boundaries regularly to monitor changes and improvements. The picture that emerged was of someone who understood exactly what he owned and had been patient enough to wait for the right time to act on that knowledge. "Harold was real particular about who he trusted," Frank said as our conversation wound down. "If he left this place to you, he had good reasons for it. He wouldn't have done that lightly." That afternoon, David and I hiked Harold's trails one more time, trying to memorize the way afternoon light filtered through the trees and the sounds of wind moving through the forest canopy. I still loved the property for its natural beauty, but I knew that beauty was about to be overshadowed by its commercial potential. "Are you going to develop it?" David asked as we sat on the ridge that offered the best view of the surrounding valley. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me thinks Harold would want me to preserve what he protected all those years, but another part of me thinks he left it to me because he trusted me to make the right decisions about its future." David squeezed my hand. "Maybe those aren't contradictory. Maybe there's a way to honor both the land and the opportunities it provides." That evening, as we drove back to Portland, I made a decision that would prove to be pivotal. Instead of waiting for the energy companies to approach me, I was going to be proactive about controlling how information about my inheritance became public. If Jennifer and the rest of my family were going to learn about the land's true value, I wanted it to happen on my terms, rather than through gossip or media coverage. The decision meant accelerating my timeline for legal preparation and family conversations, but it also meant I could shape the narrative instead of reacting to someone else's version of events. Patricia Klein had warned me that news of valuable natural resources had a way of spreading quickly once it began, and I preferred to get ahead of that process rather than be swept along by it. Monday morning brought a call that confirmed my instincts about taking control of the situation. Dr. Barnes contacted me with news that a regional energy consortium was preparing to make formal offers to all landowners in the geological formation area. "They'll be contacting you within the next 2 weeks," he warned. "Once they do, information about the resource potential is going to become much more widely known. You should be prepared for media attention and community interest." The timeline was shorter than I'd hoped, but it gave me a clear deadline for handling family communications and legal preparations. I called Patricia Klein immediately to schedule an emergency consultation, and then I called my mother to arrange a family meeting for that weekend. "Is everything okay?" Mom asked when I explained that I needed to talk to her and Jennifer together about Harold's inheritance. "Everything's fine, but there are some things about the property that I need to share with both of you before other people start talking about it." Mom agreed to arrange the meeting, though I could hear curiosity and concern in her voice. She understood that I wouldn't be calling a formal family discussion unless the situation was significant. The rest of the week passed in intensive preparation. Patricia Klein's team worked overtime to ensure all legal documentation was properly filed and protected. I practiced explaining the geological surveys and resource potential in terms that would be clear to people without technical backgrounds. Most importantly, I tried to mentally prepare for Jennifer's reaction to learning that her public mockery had been based on spectacularly incorrect assumptions. Thursday brought another complication I hadn't anticipated. Linda Washington approached me after school with news that someone had been asking questions about my family situation. A man came by the office today claiming to be a journalist working on a story about inheritance disputes in Oregon, she said. He wanted to know if I had any information about teachers who'd recently received valuable property inheritances. My stomach dropped. What did you tell him? I told him that we don't discuss our staff members' personal situations with strangers and suggested he contact the district's public information office if he had legitimate media inquiries. Linda paused. Sarah, is there something I should know about? Are you dealing with some kind of legal problem? I realized that my attempts to handle the situation discreetly were already being undermined by outside interest. The Energy Consortium's plans to make offers were apparently generating preliminary media attention, and someone had connected my name to the story. It's complicated, I told Linda, but you did the right thing. I'm not ready to discuss this publicly yet. That evening, I called Patricia Klein to report the journalist contact. Her response was immediate and decisive. Sarah, we need to move faster than we'd planned. If media outlets are already investigating inheritance stories in the region, it won't be long before someone identifies you specifically. We should schedule a press conference for next week, right after your family meeting. The suggestion of a press conference felt surreal. 2 months earlier, I'd been an anonymous elementary school teacher whose biggest public exposure was chaperoning field trips. Now I was potentially going to be standing in front of cameras explaining how I'd inherited millions of dollars worth of natural resources. Do I have a choice? I asked. You always have choices, Patricia replied, but controlling the narrative is usually better than letting other people define it for you. We can craft a statement that focuses on your commitment to responsible development and environmental stewardship. That positions you as thoughtful and principled, rather than just lucky. The weekend family meeting was scheduled for Sunday afternoon at my mother's house. Saturday night, I lay awake rehearsing different ways to explain the situation, trying to find words that would convey the magnitude of what I'd discovered without sounding like I was gloating about Jennifer's public mistake. Sunday morning, David offered to come with me for moral support, but I decided this was something I needed to handle alone. Family dynamics were complicated enough without adding an outside observer, even one as supportive as David. Mom lived in a ranch-style house in southeast Portland that she'd bought after my father died. It was comfortable and practical, decorated with family photos and the kind of middle-class furnishings that suggested financial security without ostentation. Jennifer arrived exactly on time, dressed in the casual but expensive clothes she favored for weekend family obligations. So what's this big mystery about Harold's property? Jennifer asked as soon as we'd settled in Mom's living room. Her tone suggested she expected something mildly interesting but not earth-shattering. I took a deep breath and began with the geological surveys, explaining how I'd learned that Harold's land sat on top of confirmed natural gas reserves and rare mineral deposits. Jennifer's expression grew increasingly skeptical as I described Dr. Barnes's assessment and the infrastructure development plans that would dramatically increase property values. Wait, Jennifer interrupted when I mentioned the $15 to $20 million estimate. Are you saying Harold's cabin is worth $20 million? Not the cabin itself, I clarified, the land underneath it and the resources it contains, plus the development potential once the highway expansion is completed. Jennifer stared at me for a long moment, her lawyer's mind clearly working through the implications. You're telling me that the property I called worthless at my engagement party is actually worth $20 million? The question hung in the air between us. This was the moment when Jennifer had to confront not just the financial magnitude of her mistake, but the public nature of her error and the cruelty she'd shown in making my inheritance the entertainment for her social circle. Mom spoke first, her voice quiet and stunned. Sarah, are you absolutely certain about this? Have you had independent confirmation of these assessments? I explained about Patricia Klein's legal research and the multiple expert evaluations that had confirmed the property's value and resource potential. I also mentioned the Energy Consortium's plans to make formal offers and the media interest that was already beginning to emerge. Jennifer's face had gone through several color changes during my explanation, settling on a pale shade that suggested she was processing the full scope of what I was telling her. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled, so when I stood up at my engagement party and told a room full of people that you'd inherited worthless trees and a rundown cabin, I was actually describing property worth more money than everyone in that room will earn in their lifetimes combined. The statement was accurate, but it also revealed Jennifer's primary concern. She wasn't thinking about the financial opportunity I now faced or the complicated decisions I'd need to make about development versus conservation. She was thinking about her reputation among her social and professional circles. Jennifer, I said gently, you were working with the same information everyone else had. Nobody knew what Harold had really left me. But now everyone's going to know, she replied, her lawyer's mind already anticipating the social and professional consequences. When this story becomes public, everyone who was at that party is going to remember what I said. They're going to know I stood up in front of them and made jokes about something worth $20 million. Mom reached out and touched Jennifer's arm. Honey, people will understand that you didn't know, will they? Jennifer asked bitterly.
Or will they think I'm the kind of person who mocks her sister's good fortune? Because that's exactly what I did, even if I didn't know it was good fortune at the time. The conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from tax implications to family dynamics to media strategy. Jennifer asked detailed questions about the legal and financial aspects of the inheritance, her professional training kicking in as she worked to understand the situation fully. As the meeting wound down, Jennifer made a request that I'd been expecting but hoping to avoid. Sarah, I want you to know that I don't expect any share of your inheritance. Harold left it to you and it's yours legally and morally. But I'm hoping you'll consider consulting with me on the legal and financial aspects of managing it. This is the kind of complex situation that requires sophisticated professional guidance. The offer was reasonable and probably wise from a practical standpoint. Jennifer's expertise in corporate law would be valuable in navigating energy company negotiations and development agreements. But accepting her help would also mean involving her directly in decisions about Harold's legacy and my future. Let me think about it, I said. Right now I'm still trying to understand all my options. We parted that afternoon with our family dynamics fundamentally changed but not yet fully resolved. Jennifer's public humiliation of me had been based on ignorance rather than malice, but the cruelty had been real regardless of her intentions. How we moved forward would depend on whether she could acknowledge that and whether I was prepared to forgive it. The next morning, Patricia Klein called with news that accelerated everything. The Energy Consortium is planning to announce their regional development plans this Friday, she said. That means your story is going to break whether we're ready or not. I strongly recommend we schedule our press conference for Thursday afternoon so you can control the initial narrative. The timeline left me less than a week to prepare for something I'd never imagined doing, standing in front of cameras and microphones to explain how I'd inherited millions of dollars and what I planned to do with that responsibility. It also meant that Jennifer's prediction was about to come true. Everyone who'd been at her engagement party, everyone who'd laughed at her description of my worthless inheritance, was about to learn exactly how wrong their assumptions had been. The question now was whether I was ready for the attention and scrutiny that would inevitably follow that revelation. Thursday morning arrived with an unseasonably warm May sunshine that felt like a good omen as I prepared for the press conference that would change everything. Patricia Klein's team had arranged for the event to be held at the downtown Portland offices of First National Trust Company in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River. The setting was designed to convey both professionalism and transparency, suggesting that my story was being handled by serious financial institutions rather than opportunistic individuals. Margaret Rodriguez, the senior trust officer, who would soon become the most important person in my professional life, met me in the lobby at 9 o'clock sharp. She was a woman in her late 40s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of calm confidence that comes from decades of managing complex financial situations. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine, and her presence immediately reassuring. "Miss Mitchell, I'm delighted to finally meet you in person," she said as we rode the elevator to the conference room. "I've been reviewing your great-uncle's estate documentation, and I must say Harold Mitchell was an exceptionally thoughtful man when it came to long-term financial planning." The comment surprised me. I thought Harold just owned the cabin and the land. "Are you saying there's more to the estate?" Margaret's smile widened slightly. "That's exactly what we're here to discuss. Patricia Klein's legal team has done excellent work identifying the surface assets, but Harold's estate planning went considerably deeper than anyone realized." We entered the conference room where Patricia Klein and her associate were already reviewing notes and preparing materials for the press conference. Dr. Barnes had also arrived, bringing additional geological surveys and resource assessments that had been completed over the past week. The table was covered with maps, legal documents, and financial projections that represented the most comprehensive analysis of Harold's bequest to date. "Sarah," Patricia said, rising to greet me, "we have some significant developments to discuss before the press conference begins." Margaret Rodriguez took a seat at the head of the table and opened a leather portfolio that appeared to contain substantial documents. "Miss Mitchell, when your great-uncle established his estate planning structure, he created what's known as a perpetual trust. On the surface, it appeared that he was simply leaving you real property. In reality, he was naming you as the beneficiary of a much more sophisticated financial instrument." She spread several documents across the table, pointing to sections that had been highlighted and annotated. Harold didn't just own 40 acres of land in Central Oregon. Over the course of 30 years, he systematically acquired mineral rights, water rights, and development options across more than 1,200 acres throughout the region. The cabin property was just the visible portion of a much larger investment strategy. My head began spinning as Margaret continued her explanation. Harold had apparently been operating as what she called a stealth land investor, using his position at the county planning department to identify properties with hidden value and quietly acquiring rights that other owners didn't realize they possessed or didn't think were worth maintaining. The natural gas reserves that Dr. Barnes identified extend across this entire portfolio. Margaret continued, and Harold retained extraction rights on all of it. But more importantly, he established agreements with adjacent landowners that give you leverage over the entire regional development project. Patricia Klein leaned forward. "Margaret, are you saying that Sarah doesn't just own valuable land? Are you saying she owns controlling interest in the entire regional resource development?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. Harold structured the trust so that no major extraction or development project in this region can proceed without the beneficiaries' consent and participation. Sarah doesn't just own valuable resources, she owns the key that unlocks everyone else's valuable resources." The information was almost too much to process. I'd gone from thinking I owned 40 acres of trees to learning I owned $20 million worth of resources to discovering that I actually controlled development rights affecting hundreds of millions of dollars in regional economic activity. Harold's quiet, simple lifestyle had been concealing financial sophistication that rivaled major corporate strategies. "How much are we actually talking about?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Margaret consulted her notes and projected financial analyses. Conservative estimates suggest the perpetual trust is valued at approximately $75 million based on confirmed resources and current market conditions. But if regional development proceeds as projected, the ultimate value could exceed $200 million over the next decade. $75 million. The number echoed in my mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. Jennifer's public mockery of my small inheritance had been off by a factor that seemed almost comical if it weren't so devastating to everyone's previous assumptions about Harold's legacy. Dr. Barnes spoke up from his position across the table. "Sarah, this puts you in an extraordinarily powerful position regarding regional development. The Energy Consortium that's been conducting surveys throughout the area needs your cooperation to make their project economically viable. Without access to your holdings, their entire investment becomes questionable." Patricia Klein was already thinking ahead to the strategic implications. "This changes our approach to the press conference completely. We're not just announcing that Sarah inherited valuable land, we're announcing that she's become one of the most significant landowners in Central Oregon and a key decision maker in the region's economic future." The press conference was scheduled to begin in 2 hours, and the scope of what I needed to explain had just expanded exponentially. I was no longer just a teacher who'd inherited a valuable property. I was potentially someone whose decisions would affect jobs, community development, environmental protection, and regional economic growth for decades to come. Margaret Rodriguez seemed to understand my overwhelmed expression. "Sarah, I want you to know that Harold included very specific instructions about supporting the trust beneficiary through exactly this kind of revelation. He anticipated that the magnitude of his gift might initially feel overwhelming, and he established provisions for comprehensive financial management and professional guidance." She handed me another document, this one bearing Harold's familiar handwriting. "He left you a personal letter that was meant to be delivered when the full scope of the trust became known." I opened the envelope with trembling hands, immediately recognizing Harold's precise script and thoughtful phrasing. "My dear Sarah," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then Margaret has explained the true nature of what I've left in your care. I know this probably feels overwhelming right now, and I want you to understand why I chose to structure things this way. I've spent 30 years watching development destroy beautiful places because the people who loved those places didn't have the economic power to protect them. I also watched valuable resources go undeveloped because the people who controlled them couldn't afford to wait for the right opportunities. You're the only person in our family who ever visited my cabin because you appreciated what it was, not because you wanted something from me. You understood that value isn't always visible on the surface, and you had the patience to look deeper when others saw only problems. The trust gives you choices I never had. You can preserve what deserves preservation, develop what should be developed, and ensure that progress happens in ways that respect both economic opportunity and environmental responsibility. Most importantly, you can make these decisions from a position of strength rather than desperation. I know this is a lot to ask of someone who chose teaching because she wanted to help children learn and grow, but I believe the same instincts that make you a good teacher will make you a wise steward of this trust. Trust your judgment, seek good advice, and remember that the greatest gift isn't the money itself, but the freedom to make choices based on your values rather than your financial limitations. All my love and confidence, Uncle Harold." I sat in the conference room reading Harold's letter, while the 4 other people around the table waited respectfully for my response. Outside the windows, Portland's downtown bustled with the ordinary activities of a Thursday morning, people going to work and managing the routine responsibilities of their lives. But inside this room, I was grappling with the realization that my life had just changed in ways I was only beginning to understand. "The press conference," I said finally, looking up from Harold's letter. "How do we explain this without sounding completely unbelievable?" Patricia Klein had been considering the same question. "We focus on the human story first. Harold was a man who lived modestly while building something extraordinary for someone he loved. You're a teacher who inherited not just wealth, but responsibility. The financial details support that narrative, but they don't define it." Margaret Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "People respond to authenticity.
If you're honest about feeling overwhelmed and committed to making thoughtful decisions, that will resonate more than any discussion of specific dollar amounts. The next hour passed in intensive preparation. We reviewed key facts and figures, practiced responses to likely questions, and developed a strategy for handling the inevitable media attention that would follow the announcement. Dr. Barnes provided simplified explanations of the geological surveys and resource assessments that would be accessible to general audiences. Patricia Klein briefed me on the legal safeguards that were already in place to protect the trust from various types of challenges or manipulation. At 11:30, the first reporters began arriving in the conference room. The group was small but represented significant media outlets, including the Portland Business Journal, the Oregon Environmental Coalition newsletter, and 2 television stations that covered economic development stories. Patricia Klein had deliberately kept the invitation list limited to serious journalists, rather than creating a media circus that might sensationalize the story. As I took my place at the front of the room, I caught sight of a familiar face in the back row. Frank Peterson, Harold's neighbor, had somehow learned about the press conference and driven down from Central Oregon to attend. He gave me an encouraging nod, and I realized that having someone there who had actually known Harold made me feel more grounded in the purpose of what I was about to do. "Thank you all for coming," I began, looking directly at the small group of reporters rather than reading from prepared notes. 3 months ago, my great-uncle Harold Mitchell passed away and left me what appeared to be a small inheritance, a cabin and 40 acres of forest land in Central Oregon. At my sister's engagement party, that inheritance became a source of family humor because everyone assumed Harold had left me something with more sentimental value than financial worth. I paused, looking around the room and making eye contact with individual reporters. What we didn't know was that Harold had spent 30 years quietly building one of the most significant land and resource portfolios in the Pacific Northwest. What appeared to be a simple bequest was actually my great-uncle's way of placing me in stewardship of a perpetual trust valued at $75 million. The room was completely silent. I could see reporters checking their notes and calculations, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd just told them. $75 million was serious money even in Portland's expensive real estate market, but the story's power came from the dramatic reversal between perception and reality. Harold left me a letter explaining his intentions, I continued, pulling out the relevant passage from his note. He wrote that he wanted to give me choices he never had, the ability to preserve what deserves preservation, develop what should be developed, and ensure that progress happens in ways that respect both economic opportunity and environmental responsibility. A reporter from the Business Journal raised her hand. "Miss Mitchell, can you help us understand how a county employee was able to accumulate assets worth $75 million without anyone in his family knowing about it?" Margaret Rodriguez answered this question, explaining Harold's systematic approach to acquiring mineral rights and development options over 3 decades. She described how his position at the county planning department had given him access to information about future infrastructure projects and geological surveys that weren't widely known to private landowners. Harold wasn't doing anything inappropriate or illegal, Margaret clarified. He was simply paying attention to publicly available information that other people weren't tracking, and he was patient enough to make investments based on long-term rather than short-term thinking. Another reporter asked about my plans for managing such a significant inheritance. This was the question I'd been most concerned about, because I honestly wasn't sure how to answer it. "I'm still learning about the full scope of what Harold left me," I said truthfully. "Right now, my priority is making sure I understand all the environmental and economic implications before I make any major decisions. I've been working with legal and financial advisors to ensure that whatever I choose to do honors both Harold's intentions and the region's long-term interests." The questions continued for nearly an hour, covering everything from tax implications to environmental protection to regional economic development. I tried to answer honestly while acknowledging the limits of what I currently understood about my new responsibilities. As the press conference concluded, Frank Peterson approached me with a broad smile. "Harold would be proud of how you handled that," he said simply. "You sounded exactly like him when he talked about being a steward rather than just an owner." That afternoon, the story began appearing online and in local news broadcasts. The headline in the Portland Business Journal read, "Teacher inherits $75 million land trust, becomes key player in regional development." The television coverage focused on the dramatic contrast between my modest apartment and the magnitude of Harold's hidden wealth. By evening, my phone was ringing constantly with calls from energy company representatives, real estate developers, environmental groups, and financial advisors offering various services. Patricia Klein had warned me this would happen, and we'd established a system for filtering inquiries through her office so I wouldn't be overwhelmed by direct solicitation. The most challenging calls came from my family. Mom called first, her voice shaking with emotion as she processed the true scope of what Harold had done. $75 million, Sarah. Harold left you $75 million, and we all thought it was worthless land. Jennifer's call came an hour later. She'd clearly been watching the news coverage and reading the online articles, and her legal mind was working through all the implications of the story. "Sarah, I need you to know that I understand now how completely inappropriate my behavior was at the engagement party. I publicly humiliated you over an inheritance that's worth more money than most people see in several lifetimes." Her voice carried a combination of embarrassment and something that might have been genuine remorse. "I know apologies don't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I'm ashamed of how I treated you, and I'm prepared to do whatever I can to make amends." The conversation with Jennifer lasted for more than an hour, as she worked through her feelings about the situation, and I tried to process my own emotions about her apology. She was clearly struggling with the public nature of her mistake and the way the news coverage had highlighted the contrast between her assumptions and reality. "Everyone who was at that party has seen the news stories by now," she said. "They all know that when I stood up and made jokes about your inheritance, I was actually mocking something worth $75 million. I don't know how I'm going to face those people again." I found myself feeling something unexpected sympathy for Jennifer's embarrassment. Her behavior had been cruel, but it had been based on the same assumptions everyone shared. Now she was facing the social consequences of that cruelty in a very public way. "Jennifer," I said finally, "you were wrong about Harold's bequest, but you weren't wrong because you're a bad person. You were wrong because nobody knew what Harold had actually done. The real question is what we do with this situation going forward." The conversation ended with Jennifer asking if she could help me navigate the legal and financial complexities I was now facing. Her offer was the same one she'd made at our family meeting, but now it carried different weight because her embarrassment had made her more genuine in acknowledging the magnitude of what I was dealing with. Over the next week, my life settled into a new routine that bore no resemblance to my previous existence. Mornings were spent at Franklin Elementary, teaching my third graders and trying to maintain some normalcy in my daily schedule. Afternoons were consumed with meetings at Margaret Rodriguez's trust management office, where teams of financial advisors, legal experts, and development consultants helped me understand the various options for managing Harold's legacy. The energy consortium that Dr. Barnes had mentioned made their formal offer within days of the press conference. They proposed a comprehensive development agreement that would provide me with immediate payments totaling $15 million, plus ongoing royalties that could eventually exceed $50 million over the life of the project. Margaret Rodriguez walked me through the proposal line by line, explaining the environmental assessments, community impact studies, and regulatory approvals that would be required before any actual development could begin. "This is a serious offer from a reputable consortium," she said, "but it's also just one of several approaches you could take." Environmental groups had also reached out proposing conservation strategies that would preserve the ecological integrity of Harold's holdings while still providing income through sustainable forestry and ecotourism partnerships. These approaches offered smaller immediate returns but greater long-term environmental protection. The decision matrix was incredibly complex, involving considerations that ranged from personal values to regional economic impact, to environmental stewardship, to financial optimization. Harold's letter had acknowledged this complexity when he wrote about having choices he'd never had, but understanding those choices intellectually was different from actually making them. During this period of intensive consultation and decision-making, I continued teaching my third graders, finding that the classroom remained my most grounding influence amid all the financial and legal complexity. My students had no idea their teacher was now worth $75 million, and their concerns about multiplication tables and reading comprehension helped me maintain perspective about what really mattered in daily life. Linda Washington, my principal, had been following the news coverage with interest and concern. "How are you handling all this attention?" she asked during one of our regular check-ins. "Some days better than others," I admitted. "The money creates opportunities I never imagined having, but it also creates responsibilities I never wanted." Linda nodded thoughtfully. "Are you planning to continue teaching?" The question had been weighing on my mind for weeks. Financial necessity no longer required me to work, but teaching had always been more than just a job for me. It was how I contributed to my community and how I found meaning in daily life. "I think so," I said. "Maybe not full-time eventually, but I can't imagine completely leaving education. These kids need stability and consistency, and I need the reminder of what's really important." The decision to continue teaching, at least for the immediate future, felt like the first choice I'd made about Harold's inheritance that was clearly aligned with my personal values rather than external expectations or financial optimization. 3 weeks after the press conference, I made my first major decision about Harold's trust. Working with Margaret Rodriguez and her team, I established the Harold Mitchell Conservation and Development Foundation, a structure that would allow me to balance environmental protection with economic development, according to principles Harold had outlined in his estate planning documents. The foundation would preserve 40% of the trust's holdings as permanent conservation land, develop 30% according to sustainable resource extraction practices, and maintain the remaining 30% as flexible assets that could be adapted based on changing environmental and economic conditions. The decision meant turning down the Energy Consortium's immediate $15 million offer in favor of a more complex, but potentially more valuable long-term strategy. It also meant accepting responsibility for managing the foundation's activities and ensuring that Harold's vision of balanced stewardship was actually implemented. Jennifer, true to her word about making amends, volunteered to handle the legal structure for the foundation pro bono, using her corporate law expertise to ensure that the organization would be protected from various types of legal challenges or mismanagement. Working with her on the foundation documents gave us an opportunity to rebuild our relationship on a more equal footing. "I've been thinking about what I said at my engagement party," Jennifer told me during one of our planning sessions. "Not just the content but the attitude behind it. I think I've spent so much time measuring success in financial terms that I forgot there are other kinds of value." The foundation's establishment attracted positive media attention and support from both environmental groups and business organizations that appreciated the balanced approach to resource management. More importantly, it gave me a framework for making decisions about Harold's legacy that honored both his environmental values and his economic sophistication. 6 months after inheriting Harold's small cabin and 40 acres of trees, I stood in the same conference room at First National Trust Company, where Margaret Rodriguez had first explained the true scope of Harold's bequest. This time the meeting was to finalize agreements with the first sustainable development partners, who would work with the foundation on responsible resource extraction. The conference room's windows still offered the same view of the Willamette River, but everything about my relationship to that view had changed. I was no longer Sarah Mitchell, the elementary school teacher who'd been publicly humiliated for inheriting worthless land. I was Sarah Mitchell, director of a $75 million conservation and development foundation, responsible for decisions that would affect environmental protection and economic opportunity throughout Central Oregon. Margaret Rodriguez sat across from me, reviewing the final contract documents with the satisfaction of someone whose careful work had achieved its intended results. "Harold would be pleased with how you've approached this responsibility," she said. "You've found a way to honor both the economic potential and the environmental values he cared about." The foundation's work was just beginning, but the structure was in place to ensure that Harold's hidden wealth would be used according to principles he'd established and values I'd committed to upholding. More importantly, I'd discovered that managing significant wealth responsibly required the same kinds of careful attention and long-term thinking that made someone a good teacher. As I signed the final documents that afternoon, I thought about the journey that had brought me from Jennifer's engagement party mockery to this moment of genuine accomplishment. The external transformation was obvious, from financial struggle to financial security, from family embarrassment to community leadership, from perceived failure to recognized success, but the internal transformation was more significant. I'd learned to trust my own judgment about what mattered, even when others couldn't see the value in my choices. I'd discovered that true worth isn't determined by other people's recognition or approval, but by the alignment between your actions and your deepest values. Harold's gift hadn't just changed my financial situation, it had taught me the same lesson his letter described, that the greatest inheritance isn't money itself, but the freedom to make choices based on what you believe is right, rather than what you can afford to do. That evening, David and I drove out to Harold's cabin one more time before the foundation's conservation work began. The property would remain undeveloped, preserved as
an example of the old-growth forest ecosystem that had originally covered much of Central Oregon. Harold's simple lifestyle in the midst of hidden wealth would be honored by maintaining the land exactly as he'd known and loved it. We sat on the cabin's front porch as the sun set through the Douglas fir canopy, listening to the sounds of evening wildlife and feeling the peace that Harold had protected for 30 years. The land was beautiful in its simplicity, valuable beyond any financial measure, and now permanently preserved, because Harold had trusted me to see what others had missed. Jennifer's mockery of my small inheritance had been spectacularly wrong about the financial value of Harold's bequest. But in a deeper sense, she'd been right about one thing: Harold had left me something that perfectly matched who I was. Not because I was impractical or naive, but because I was someone who understood that the most precious things often hide their value beneath unremarkable surfaces. The teacher in me recognized this as the kind of lesson that changes how you see everything, that worth isn't always visible at first glance, that patience and careful attention reveal truths that hurried assumptions miss, and that the greatest treasures are often the ones that others overlook entirely. As we drove back to Portland that night, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for Harold's financial gift, but for the lesson his trust had taught me about recognizing value in unexpected places. The $75 million would fund important conservation and development work, but the real inheritance was the understanding that my own worth had never depended on anyone else's ability to recognize it. 3 months later, the Harold Mitchell Conservation and Development Foundation held its first annual community meeting, bringing together local residents, environmental groups, business leaders, and government officials to discuss the foundation's progress and future plans. The meeting was held at a community center in Bend, close to the land that had started everything. Frank Peterson was in the front row, beaming with pride as I presented the foundation's first-year accomplishments and outlined our long-term vision for balanced regional development. After the formal presentation, he approached me with the same warm smile he'd shown at the press conference months earlier. "You know what Harold would say if he could see this?" Frank asked. "He'd say you proved that good judgment is worth more than good luck." The insight captured something important about the entire experience. Harold's bequest had been extraordinarily valuable, but managing it wisely had required the same kinds of careful thinking and principled decision-making that made someone effective in any responsible position. I'd started this journey as a teacher who'd been mocked for inheriting something worthless. I'd ended it as someone who understood that true inheritance isn't what others give you, but what you choose to do with whatever gifts you receive. The foundation's work would continue for decades, protecting environmental resources while creating economic opportunities that strengthened local communities. Harold's hidden wealth had become a lasting legacy that honored both his environmental values and his economic sophistication. More importantly, I'd learned that the most valuable inheritance of all was the confidence to trust my own judgment about what mattered, regardless of whether others could see the wisdom in my choices. That lesson was worth more than $75 million, and it was something no one could ever take away from me. 2 years after Margaret Rodriguez first explained the true scope of Harold's perpetual trust, I stood in the library of what had once been his simple cabin, but was now the headquarters of the Harold Mitchell Conservation and Development Foundation. The original structure remained unchanged, honoring Harold's preference for simplicity, but we'd added a modern research facility and conference center that blended seamlessly into the surrounding forest. The morning sunlight streamed through windows that overlooked the preserved old-growth forest, illuminating a conference table where representatives from 3 different environmental organizations were reviewing our latest sustainability report. The foundation had exceeded every projection for balanced resource management, generating over $12 million in annual revenue while maintaining strict environmental protection standards across our conservation lands. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, our newly appointed Director of Environmental Sciences, looked up from the quarterly assessment with visible satisfaction. The ecosystem restoration project in Sector 7 is ahead of schedule, she reported. We're seeing species recovery rates that exceed our most optimistic projections, and the carbon sequestration measurements are remarkable. Elizabeth had joined our team 6 months earlier, bringing expertise from both the Nature Conservancy and the Department of Environmental Quality. Her appointment represented the Foundation's commitment to hiring the best possible talent, rather than simply working with whoever was locally available. We'd learned that managing resources worth $75 million required professional excellence at every level. The Foundation's success had attracted attention from conservation groups nationwide, but also from energy companies who'd initially been frustrated by our refusal to accept their standard development offers. Over time, several of these companies had approached us with innovative proposals that aligned economic opportunity with environmental responsibility, creating partnerships that benefited everyone involved. Pacific Northwest Energy Solutions had become our most productive collaborator, developing extraction techniques that minimized environmental impact while maximizing resource recovery efficiency. Their approach required higher upfront investment, but generated superior long-term returns, both financially and environmentally. More importantly, their methods could be replicated in other regions where traditional extraction techniques had created environmental damage. The pilot program results are remarkable, said James Morrison, Pacific Northwest Energy's project director, as he presented their latest findings to our board of directors. We're achieving 93% resource recovery with less than 12% of the environmental footprint associated with conventional methods. The technical details were complex, but the implications were clear. Responsible resource management could be more profitable than destructive alternatives if stakeholders were willing to invest in superior methodologies rather than settling for quick profits. Harold's vision of balanced stewardship was proving economically superior to traditional approaches that prioritized short-term gains over sustainable practices. These developments had transformed my role from inheritance recipient to recognized expert in sustainable resource management. I'd been invited to speak at conferences in Seattle, Denver, and Washington, D.C., sharing the Foundation's approach with government officials and industry leaders who were grappling with similar challenges in their own regions. The speaking engagements were professionally rewarding, but they also felt surreal compared to my origins as an elementary school teacher who'd been mocked for inheriting worthless land. Standing in front of audiences that included senators and corporate executives, explaining innovative approaches to conservation finance and sustainable development required confidence I'd never imagined possessing. My relationship with teaching had evolved rather than disappeared entirely. I'd stepped back from full-time classroom responsibilities, but I continued working with Franklin Elementary on environmental education programs that brought students to the Foundation's research facilities for hands-on learning about forest ecology and sustainable resource management. Miss Mitchell, why did the trees grow back so fast after the controlled burns? Asked Emma, an 8-year-old whose curiosity reminded me of my former students' endless questions about how the world worked. Because fire is actually part of how these forests stay healthy, I explained, kneeling beside her as we examined new seedlings emerging from the forest floor.
The trees and the fire have been working together for thousands of years. These educational programs had become some of the Foundation's most fulfilling work, connecting urban children with natural systems they'd never experienced and helping them understand the complex relationships between human activities and environmental health. Harold would have appreciated this aspect of our mission, I thought, since education had always been central to genuine conservation efforts. The Foundation's success had also transformed my family dynamics in ways I was still processing. Jennifer's law firm had become our primary legal counsel, handling increasingly complex agreements with government agencies and corporate partners. Working together professionally had rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than childhood rivalry patterns. The new partnership agreement with the Forest Service is ready for your review, Jennifer said during one of our regular business meetings. Her tone was professional but warm, reflecting the genuine friendship that had emerged from our shared commitment to managing Harold's legacy responsibly. Jennifer had proven exceptionally skilled at negotiating agreements that protected the Foundation's interests while maintaining positive relationships with regulatory agencies and community stakeholders. Her experience with corporate law translated effectively to the specialized legal challenges we faced in conservation finance and sustainable development. I've been thinking about something, Jennifer said as we concluded our review of the Forest Service documentation. Remember when I made that speech at my engagement party about your worthless's inheritance? The memory still carried emotional weight, though time had transformed embarrassment into something more like rueful amusement. How could I forget? I was wrong about everything, obviously. But I've been wondering lately if maybe I was also wrong about why I said those things. Jennifer paused, choosing her words carefully. I think I was threatened by the fact that you were content with your choices, even when they didn't lead to conventional measures of success. Her insight was perceptive and probably accurate. Jennifer's mockery had been cruel, but it had also reflected her own insecurity about whether financial achievement was sufficient justification for the compromises she'd made in her personal and professional life. You seemed so comfortable with teaching and living simply, she continued. Part of me envied that confidence and part of me needed to prove it was naive or impractical. The conversation represented a level of emotional honesty that would have been impossible during our childhood or early adulthood. Harold's bequest had created space for us to move beyond competitive patterns and build a relationship based on mutual appreciation for each other's strengths. My mother had also been changed by the Foundation's work, though in more subtle ways. She'd become one of our most effective community liaisons, using her real estate experience and local connections to build support for our projects among property owners and business leaders throughout Central Oregon. People trust you because you understand their concerns, Mom had told me during a recent family dinner. You didn't start this work as an outsider trying to impose solutions on rural communities, you started as someone who inherited responsibility and tried to manage it wisely. Her observation highlighted something important about the Foundation's approach that had contributed to our success. Rather than presenting ourselves as experts from Portland who knew better than local residents, we'd consistently positioned ourselves as community members who were trying to solve shared challenges through careful collaboration. This approach had been particularly important in our relationships with ranchers and farmers whose properties bordered Foundation lands. Instead of creating adversarial relationships over environmental regulations, we developed cooperative agreements that benefited both conservation goals and agricultural productivity. Tom Bradley, whose cattle ranch shared a 2-mile border with our conservation area, had initially been suspicious of our intentions but had become one of our strongest supporters after seeing the practical benefits of our approach to land management. These conservation people know what they're doing, Tom had told a local newspaper reporter. My pastures have never been healthier and my cattle have access to better water sources because of their watershed restoration work. These kinds of testimonials from local residents had been crucial to building community support for the foundation's expansion into adjacent areas. Rather than imposing environmental protection from above, we were demonstrating that conservation could enhance rather than threaten rural economic activity when it was implemented thoughtfully. The Foundation's reputation for effective collaboration had attracted inquiries from government agencies and environmental groups in other states who were interested in replicating our model. We'd provided consulting services to similar projects in Colorado, Montana, and Northern California, sharing methodologies that had proven effective in balancing conservation with economic development. Your approach to stakeholder engagement is particularly innovative, Dr. Sarah Williams from the Colorado State Environmental Department had told me during a recent consultation visit. You've found ways to align environmental protection with local economic interests instead of treating them as competing priorities. These consulting relationships had generated additional revenue for the Foundation while spreading conservation practices that honored both environmental values and community needs. More importantly, they had demonstrated that Harold's vision of balanced stewardship could be adapted to different regional contexts and ecological challenges. The Foundation's growth had also created employment opportunities that strengthened local communities rather than displacing existing economic activity. We now employed 43 people full-time, from forest technicians and administrative staff to research scientists and community outreach coordinators. Many of our employees were local residents who'd gained specialized skills through Foundation training programs, creating career paths that allowed young people to remain in rural communities instead of migrating to urban areas for professional opportunities. Maria Santos, our head of field operations, had started as a part-time trail maintenance worker and earned certifications in forest management and ecological restoration through Foundation-sponsored training. This job lets me work outdoors doing something meaningful without having to choose between career advancement and staying close to my family, she'd explained to a visiting journalist. These employment opportunities represented something Harold would have appreciated: the transformation of environmental protection from an abstract concept imposed by distant bureaucrats into concrete work that provided good jobs for local residents while achieving genuine conservation goals. The Foundation's financial performance had exceeded every projection, generating returns that allowed us to expand our conservation work while building substantial reserves for future projects. Margaret Rodriguez had been essential to this success, applying sophisticated financial management techniques to ensure that the Foundation's resources were allocated efficiently and protected from various types of economic volatility. Conservative projections suggest the Foundation's assets will exceed $100 million within 5 years, Margaret reported during our quarterly board meeting. This growth is based on sustainable revenue streams rather than speculative investments, which provide stability for long-term planning. The financial security created space for ambitious projects that required multi-year commitments and substantial upfront investments. We were developing partnerships with universities to conduct research on climate adaptation strategies, working with indigenous communities to incorporate traditional ecological knowledge into our management practices, and exploring innovative financing mechanisms that could be replicated by other conservation organizations. These projects represented the kind of forward-thinking approach that Harold had embodied in his own investment strategies. Rather than simply managing existing resources, we were creating new models for conservation finance that could generate lasting impact beyond our specific geographical area. The Foundation's success had inevitably attracted media attention that sometimes focused more on the dramatic story of my inheritance than on our actual conservation work. Profile articles in national magazines occasionally emphasized the rags to riches narrative rather than the sophisticated environmental management we developed. Teacher inherits $75 million, becomes conservation leader was a typical headline that captured public attention but missed the complexity of what we'd actually accomplished. The real story wasn't about sudden wealth, but about the patient work of building institutions that could protect environmental resources while supporting community economic development. I'd learned to navigate media interviews by redirecting attention from my personal story to the Foundation's methodologies and results. The interesting question isn't how I inherited valuable land, I would tell reporters, but how communities can develop sustainable approaches to resource management that benefit both environmental protection and local economies. This approach had been effective in attracting serious coverage from business and environmental publications that focused on our innovations in conservation finance and stakeholder collaboration. These articles had been more valuable than personality profiles in building the Foundation's reputation among professionals who might replicate our methods. The Foundation's work had also attracted attention from academic researchers who were studying new models of environmental philanthropy and community-based conservation. Dr. Robert Chen from Stanford's environmental program had spent a sabbatical year working with our research team, documenting practices that could be taught in graduate programs and applied in other contexts. What you've achieved here represents a significant advance in conservation practice, Dr. Chen had told me as his sabbatical concluded. You've demonstrated that environmental protection can be economically superior to resource exploitation when stakeholders are willing to invest in superior methodologies. His research had resulted in several academic papers that positioned the Foundation's work as a case study in innovative environmental management, generating interest from other scholars and practitioners who were grappling with similar challenges. These academic connections had led to guest teaching opportunities at universities throughout the Pacific Northwest, where I'd shared the Foundation's experience with graduate students who were preparing for careers in environmental management and sustainable development. The key insight, I would tell these students, is that environmental protection and economic development aren't necessarily competing priorities. With sufficient patience and sophistication, they can be mutually reinforcing approaches to community development. These teaching experiences had been personally rewarding while also serving the Foundation's mission of spreading effective conservation practices to new generations of environmental professionals. 5 years after Jennifer's engagement party mockery of my small inheritance, I was invited to speak at a conference on rural economic development that was being held at the same Portland Country Club where she'd made those comments. The irony was too perfect to ignore, though the invitation had come based on the Foundation's reputation rather than any connection to past family embarrassments. The conference organizers had asked me to present a case study on community-based conservation as an economic development strategy, focusing on measurable outcomes rather than theoretical approaches. The audience would include rural development specialists, government officials, and community leaders from throughout the Pacific Northwest. Standing at the podium in the same ballroom where Jennifer had described my inheritance as 40 acres of worthless trees, I looked out at an audience that included many of the same people who'd laughed at her description of Harold's consolation prize. 5 years ago, I inherited what appeared to be a modest bequest, a cabin and 40 acres of forest land in Central Oregon. Today, that inheritance has become the foundation for a $75 million conservation and development trust that employs 43 people, protects 1,200 acres of critical habitat, and generates over $12 million in annual economic activity. The room was completely silent as I continued describing the Foundation's evolution from Harold's simple bequest to a recognized leader in sustainable resource management. Many people in the audience remembered the original story of my inheritance, but few had followed the Foundation's subsequent development. The transformation wasn't based on luck or sudden discovery of hidden resources, I explained. It was based on applying patient sophisticated analysis to understand the genuine potential of undervalued assets, then developing innovative approaches to realize that potential responsibly. The presentation continued for 45 minutes, covering the Foundation's methodologies, financial performance, environmental outcomes, and community impact. I concluded by emphasizing that our success could be replicated in other regions where communities were willing to invest in long-term thinking rather than pursuing short-term extractive profits. During the question and answer session, a familiar voice spoke from the back of the room. Jennifer had attended the conference as part of her firm's business development activities, and she'd clearly been thinking about the broader implications of what I'd described. "Miss Mitchell, what advice would you give to communities that want to develop similar approaches but lack the initial capital that your inheritance provided?" The question was thoughtful and professionally appropriate, showing how completely our relationship had evolved from childhood rivalry to mutual professional respect. It also highlighted something important about scaling the Foundation's approach to other contexts. "The financial resources were certainly helpful," I replied, "but they weren't the most important factor in our success. The key elements were patient analysis, community engagement, and willingness to invest in superior methodologies rather than settling for conventional approaches. Those elements can be developed regardless of initial capital availability." I went on to describe partnership models and financing mechanisms that could allow communities with limited resources to pursue similar projects, emphasizing collaborative approaches that combined public and private resources to achieve shared goals. The conference presentation had been professionally successful, but it also represented something personally meaningful: the completion of a transformation that had begun with public humiliation and evolved into genuine expertise and community leadership. After the presentation, several attendees approached me with questions about implementing similar projects in their own regions. These conversations represented the kind of professional recognition that Harold had probably anticipated when he structured his bequest to create opportunities rather than simply providing financial security. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from Jennifer's cruel mockery to recognition as an expert in sustainable resource management. The external transformation was obvious, but the internal change was more significant. I'd learned to trust my own judgment about what constituted valuable work, regardless of whether others immediately recognized that value. I'd discovered that authenticity and persistence could overcome initial misunderstanding and skepticism. Most importantly, I'd found that meaningful work was its own reward, independent of external validation or financial compensation. Harold's bequest had provided resources and opportunities, but the Foundation's success had ultimately depended on choices I'd made about how to use those resources responsibly. The inheritance had been valuable, but the real gift had been learning that I possessed the judgment and determination to manage significant responsibility effectively. That night, I received an unexpected phone call from Frank Peterson, Harold's neighbor, who'd been following the Foundation's progress through local news coverage and community reports. "Sarah, I wanted you to know that Harold would be proud of what you've accomplished," Frank said. "He always believed you had the right instincts for this kind of work, but even he might be surprised by how much you've achieved." The conversation reminded me of Harold's letter, which I still kept in my office as a reminder of his faith in my ability to manage his legacy wisely. "Trust your judgment, seek good advice, and remember that the greatest gift isn't the money itself, but the freedom to make choices based on your values, rather than your financial limitations." 5 years later, I understood what he'd meant. The $75 million inheritance had been valuable, but the real gift had been the opportunity to discover that my own judgment was reliable, my values were sound, and my capacity for meaningful work was greater than I'd ever imagined. The Foundation would continue growing and evolving, protecting environmental resources while supporting community economic development throughout the Pacific Northwest. But the most important outcome of Harold's bequest wasn't institutional success or financial returns. The most important outcome was learning that worth doesn't depend on other people's recognition or approval, but on the alignment between your actions and your deepest convictions about what matters. That lesson was worth more than $75 million, and it would guide every decision I made for the rest of my life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.